All right, everybody. So now that we have a feel for some of the ways that we can label, describe, and think about the chords and the inversions and all these things that we're going to work with, and we've talked a little bit about melodic structure and focus and finding the notes from the chords that we want to use in melodies, we want to sort of look at one of the main musical contexts that we're going to be using to sort of collect all of these ideas and to work on and workshop a lot of these ideas. And that has to do with the what we call sort of a four-part texture. And really, this is all connected to writing music for the voice and writing music that we can sing, not because vocal music is better than other music or vocal music is more important than other music, but it is something that we can all inherently understand, even if we don't think of ourselves as a singer, right? I usually sort of say that we use vocal music because we were all born with a voice in our throat. If we were all born with a trombone in our throat, this would be a very different class. But since we're all singers on one level or another, or we can understand what it would mean to be a singer, we like to look at music in a vocal context because it's a lot more sort of universal for humans. So let's talk about some of the contexts and ideas that we need to be familiar with here for this. And really, the starting point for all of this is what we would call the four-part texture. You'll also hear this called chorale writing, or sort of sometimes you hear just even like choir writing. But this is basically the look of what we're talking about. So if you've ever sung in a choir or sang out of a hymnal or any kind of just pretty standard vocal musical scenario, you will have seen music on a grand staff like this with the stems going different directions. So let's unpack a little bit here the labels that we need to know. So these are representing four different parts or four different musical lines, and they would be sung or performed by a soprano on top, alto, tenor, and bass. And so the soprano and the alto parts live up on the treble clef, and the tenor and the bass parts are down there on the bass clef. Traditionally, right, we would think about the soprano and the alto parts being sung by women and the tenor and the bass parts being sung by men. That sort of has broken down a little bit in society, but if you were to sing in a choir, you're still going to find yourself in one of these four parts. And for our purposes, well, of course, these are voice parts, these are things from vocal music, we want to sort of extend this to the wider roles that these ideas have in music. So soprano really for us means the melody. Right? So when we're talking about this, we are thinking of the melody on top. The soprano sings the melody line. The bass, well, we've talked a lot about how the bass changes the feeling of the chord and the way we would use the chord through inversion. So the soprano and the bass have sort of this melodic and functional purpose, and the alto and the tenor are what we call the inner parts. They're the lines that sort of glue everything together and give us that texture and give us the richness that support the melody and fill in what the bass is trying to accomplish. So yes, these are vocal parts, and yes, this is very familiar to people who sing in choir, but we're looking at these as a much wider musical identity here. So when we're writing this music for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, we want to be really careful with our stems, because the stems on the staff are what really, really tell us who that note belongs to. So the tenor and the soprano voices, each always in this context, are stemmed upwards. Soprano and tenor always have the stems going upwards. Alto and bass always have the stems going downwards. If you had a really persnickety music fundamentals or music teacher of some kind at some point who is really, really intense about the stem direction, they would look at this and say, well, but this note's above the middle line, so the stem should go down. That's true for a single line writing, but we're writing in a four-part texture, and we've got two voices, soprano and alto in this case, happening on the same staff. So we use the stems to really clearly designate whose line is whose. So that's sort of a little bit about the naming and the way we notate this. But there are some sort of musical questions to ask too. And the first is that we've got what we're calling a 4-part texture, or chorale texture, or whatever we want to call it. But the question here is, we're using triads, which only contain 3 notes. So we've got 4 parts, but only 3 notes to go around. So that sort of leaves us with a bit of an issue that we have to figure out. And the answer to this is that we use a technique called doubling. And doubling means that 2 of the voices sing the same member of the chord. Not the same exact note necessarily, though that can happen. That happens a lot. But it doesn't have to be the exact same note. So if we look here, we've got basses on C, tenors on G, altos on E, and sopranos on C. So in this context, the basses and the sopranos are all doing C. They're all singing C. That's doubling. We would say that C is being doubled here. And so our starting technique, and really the most fundamental and important technique, is to double the root of the chord. So we've got a C, E, G chord here. We said we've got it spread out into that voicing. That's another thing you'll hear me call this a voicing, because we're choosing which voice part sings which note of the chord. And in this voicing, C is being doubled by the sopranos and the basses. This is pretty understandable why we would do it. You know, the root of the chord is by far the most stable member of the chord. So if you're going to have 2 of anything, having the root being doubled makes the most sense. Down the line, we will certainly relax this concept, and doubling will become a lot more loose and open. But here, especially at the beginning, you really, really want to be strict about your doubling, because the doubling of the root is actually sort of one of the core ideas that makes the technique that we're going to study work. So if you don't have good doubling, or if you don't double the root, a lot of the things that we're working on they're not going to actually be able to be implemented, because they're kind of built upon that structure. So make sure from here until we change down the line, until things loosen up a bit, we're going to be doubling the root. I think it's worth pointing out, here the basses and the sopranos have it. It, of course, could be any 2 voices that are doubling the root. We're going to find that for the first while, we have the root in the bass. So for most time, it's going to be the bass and somebody else doubling the root, but it doesn't have to be bass and sopranos. It could be bass and anybody else for now. So that's a little bit about the 4-part texture as a unit. Let's talk a little bit more about specifics with it. And the first idea, and this is really critical, is about spacing in the 4-part texture. So we definitely spend a lot of focus, or we put a lot of our attention on the distance between the voice parts in the 4-part texture. And a big reason for this is that one of our goals in writing music, and in particular using the 4-part texture, is for balance. We want the music to sound balanced, right? It doesn't really do us a lot of good if we've got this huge sort of muddy sound down here, and then the sopranos, right? That's not exactly the most balanced sounds, kind of unique. So we really concern ourselves with that a lot. So the distance between the voice parts really matters. And there are 2 ideas here that we want to look at. These are not the be-all, end-all ideas. You don't really have to have these deeply ingrained, but they offer a nice window into the options that are available to us. And so we're going to look at 2 things. One is called close, or sometimes you hear it called closed structure, close structure, or open structure. And we'll look at a musical example here in just a second. But close structure means that there's less than an octave between the sopranos and the tenors, meaning the note that the sopranos are singing and the note that the tenors are singing are less than an octave from one another. And open structure is the opposite, means that there is an octave or more between the note that the sopranos and tenors are singing. These just give us a sense for the ways that we can have the notes of the chord, remember with that doubling idea, spread out across our four-part texture. And as we look at this example here, let's sort of see what the result is. So here's at the beginning, we start with this idea. Right? Sort of this kind of sound. Some of you may be familiar with this. So if we listen to that first measure, if we look at just this much, see how it feels connected? Right? Kind of like it's real together. That's because this is a close structure. If we compare that with what comes next, see how it feels like it widens up, it opens up? And, this doesn't really have anything to do with the placement of the notes. Like, the sopranos go higher than before when we get to this sorry, I gave it away. It's an open structure here. To this open spot, but the basses aren't lower. It's not like the notes themselves are farther apart, right? It's not like the basses are lower than they've been and the sopranos are higher than they've been, and that's what makes it sound that way. It's the spacing of the voices and the members of the chord. So at the beginning, got this closed sound, and then all of a sudden, it opens, right? Feels much wider. And so if we look, again, what was our definition of close structure? We said less than an octave between the sopranos, who are here on G, and the tenors, who are here on B, right? So that's less than an octave. And we can see for this whole opening idea, right, they're less than an octave away. Here's G up to E. That's less than an octave, right? Same thing here. We've got F sharp to D. And now look, octave, G to G, F sharp to A, that's bigger than an octave, and G to B, right? So we can hear that changes that open structure. And if we kept going with this, it returns to that closed structure that we opened with. Oops, sorry, I played the wrong chord. Did I? Yeah. So we can hear that it sort of opens in the middle, closes back up there, and it has to do with the spacing of the notes. The distance between the soprano and the tenor is one way to look at spacing and closed versus open structure. Another result of close structure is that if we start on the tenor and go up to the altos and then the sopranos, we don't skip over any members of the chord. This is a G major chord, G, B, D. So B, the next note up is D, and then the next note up is G. If we look at this another G major chord here in open structure, the tenors are on G, or I should probably sing it down here or I'm gonna get in trouble. The tenors are on G, and then the altos are on D. So we've skipped the note B, and we go there, and then here from the altos, instead of it going G in the sopranos, it's on B, right? So that's that open structure. You only need to look at the tenors and the sopranos, but that's the result, right? So let's talk about, we looked at some of the positives here. Let's explore some of the negative things that can happen when we're voicing chords. And we want to look at two problems that can arise. So the first here is what we call voice crossing. And this is definitely an issue. So voice crossing, we sort of define it as one voice going above or below another one. And this connects to that idea of us saying that these voice parts aren't just a way of designating who's going to sing what note, but they connect to discussions of function and purpose, right? So we said that the soprano part is the melody. So if we look at this excerpt here, this example, the stemming's kind of hard to read, but the soprano part here goes B, B, G, B, A. See how that G there is stemmed up? If that's the melody, B, G, B, A, we're not going to be able to hear that melody if the altos cross over the soprano part. Even though the melody goes B, G, if the altos are up here, we're not going to hear that. We're not going to be able to tell what's going on. Same thing, this is a little more subtle here, but for voice crossing, let's look at these second two. This is maybe one of the more difficult ones to find. Look at the third and fourth chords here. Can we tell where there's voice crossing? It's not the sopranos and the altos this time. For once, sopranos and altos are playing nicely together. If we look, though, look at the tenors. The tenors are down here, and they're singing this part. Sounds lovely. The altos, they have kind of a... Oops, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. And now they're down here on D, and they move down to C. But the problem is, this E in the tenor part is higher than where the altos are singing. So the tenors are actually singing the second highest note here. And we know that the whole idea of what the tenor role is to be the lower of the inner parts, or the higher male part, right? So this is an example of voice crossing, and we'll explore some more maybe hard to find voice crossing ideas. But it goes back to that idea of balance. It's really easy to see with the outer voices. So this melody note not being able to be heard is a really clear example. Another idea would be voice crossing would be really problematic if the tenors, or anybody, were singing or playing a note lower than what the bass was supposed to be playing, right? So think about it. If you're playing bass in a band, you're supposed to be the lowest thing, right? But let's say you have a line that's low but not like super low, and then you realize that the pianist is playing way down there. You're not the lowest thing anymore, but you're the bass, right? So that's where these voice crossing ideas, they get in the way of the purpose and the function of a line. The other one that we want to introduce here is what we call a spacing error. And this is when we have more than an octave between any two parts. Now, the basses are an exception here, but let's sort of look at that. So let's look at this first chord here, and let's just look at the tenor, the alto, and the soprano parts. See how they're so nicely spread out? There's space between all of them, right? But there's not more than an octave. If we look on the second chord, though, here we got basses, we've got tenors, we've got altos, and then the sopranos way up here. This is kind of hard to tell on a piano, but I sort of call this, this is sort of a situation where somebody forgot to wear deodorant, right? The sopranos are here. They must be not smelling so good because everybody else is kind of staying away. And again, the idea we're looking for here is balance. We want it to sound balanced. Now, this little exception here says that it's okay if the basses are farther apart. Well, that seems weird. It was sort of in the second chord, if the basses and tenors and altos are here. It's a little strange for the sopranos to be, way up there. But on the second chord, it actually sounds pretty balanced. I can't actually play this all at once, but if we listen to that first chord, it actually is fine for the basses to be farther apart from the tenors, and that just has to do with the way lower notes relate to one another. This interval, I'm playing a third G to B, sounds completely fine in the middle of the keyboard, and up, higher on the keyboard sounds fine too. But the lower you go, intervals that sound okay get really muddy. And if I play like this third, that just sounds insane. So the lower we go, the more space things need. So it is not a problem for the basses to be more than an octave away. But any other two, adjacent voice parts need to be no more than an octave apart. An octave is fine, but no more. All right. Last thing here. I know this is a lot of information. Last thing to keep in mind when we start working with this 4-part vocal texture is the range of these voice parts. Now, it's not to say that we only are concerned with writing music that's going to be sung, but it's a good habit to get into to keep in mind We want to write music that's realistic, that could be done, right? So these are the ranges you want to keep in mind. The sopranos, the lowest note they should sing would be middle C. And listen to that. You don't want to write higher than that. A great soprano sounds awesome going, way up there, but we don't want to worry about that. Altos, this G up to that D on the treble clef there. Tenors, nothing below this C and nothing above that G. So you can see the tenor, look at the tenor range, is the same range as the soprano, just an octave lower. And then the basses, this E or this E is sort of a good low note. And that C is a good high note. Right, I'll sing it at pitch. You may be thinking to yourself, well, but I'm a tenor and I can sing lower than that, or I'm an alto, I can sing higher, whatever it is. But again, we're not worried about these as individual lines. We're worried about how they're going to work together in a texture. This isn't we're not looking at music, well, I could sing higher than that, or I could do this, I could do that, and it sounds great by myself. We don't care about that. We care about how this is going to work together as a musical fabric, right? Just because someone can take an amazing, ripping guitar solo doesn't mean every song needs that, right? Just because a bass player can do great slap bass doesn't mean every song needs a slap bass part. I mean, let's be honest, it does. But we're worried about the context that we can put these ideas into. And so working on this 4-part texture is a big step in that direction.